Well, good day, I hope. Let's take a look today at the categories of archaeology. We have not talked about this yet. Let me see. I guess one of you went out digging so far. I think all of you should come out once to see what it's like. Taylor, of course, has been out previously. But this Saturday, I am processing a thing. So, if you don't like to be exposed to soil, because that's too earthy, I will be, well, actually, we will be. There will be a group that is cleaning and processing things that have been found. So, washing pottery, cleaning, washing shells, sorting out bones and different things, and then this will all have to dry and then be tagged and labeled. That's the next step in the process. So step number one, I guess, is determining a place to dig, but step number two is actually digging. So instead of just talking about it or reading about it, it's doing it. So you go out and you dig, all right? You dig some holes, you find some stuff, you then kind of sort the stuff out, put it in bags, bring it back, and then you have to clean that stuff up, make sure it's all sorted right, labeled right. That's the next step. Then after that, you go through and try to look at the material more closely, see patterns, identify what you have, do comparisons, check. For example, last semester we found what's commonly called an arrowhead. So the next step will be, it's been cleaned, so the next step will be to photograph it in a way that highlights the way it looks, and then from there we will search for parallels. That is, we'll go out and search books, picture images on various websites and things to find ones that look similar, to see how they were dated, to see what kind of sites they were found at. So, for my preliminary looking, it looks like woodland period. So woodland period is roughly from about 500 AD to 1000 AD. So that projectile point, that arrowhead, is over 1,000 years old, I think it's safe to say. Because the way it's manufactured is very specific, the way that it was shaped, the way that it was. See, when you're making tools like that out of chert or flint, you have to shape it by percussion. That is, you hit it, often with a antler or bone. When you hit it at the right angle, you can cause small flakes. And if you flake it, it flakes much like glass. That is, it has conchoidal fractures, and then you can become razor sharp. Actually, it can actually be sharper than metal. Okay, so, and the way that is done, the shape and the process is chronologically, it can help you date it chronologically, sometimes also regionally, because people learn how to do it in a certain way. So that'll be the process after that. I've been trying to recruit, with no success, people in our sort of science world here at the university to take a look at the shells and take a look at the charcoal and take a look at some of those things. They've informed me that's sort of not their thing. So, okay, so we'll press on, doing the best we can. So today I want to talk about archaeology and the categories therein. People say the word archaeology, and as I pointed out on the last PowerPoint there, with pictures of Indiana Jones, he comes to mind for many people. There might be some other Hollywood images. Maybe Laura Croft comes to mind or somebody like that, right? So you'll have to find out what your own images might be. But one thing that we need to recognize is that archaeology is quite diverse. It could fit into diverse academic fields. And as I try to change the way I've said it, let me say it this way to be more politically correct. It's not as colorful, of course. Being politically correct is never as to the point, so you have to be very circumventing of the topic. But basically, archaeology is not the preferred subject of any discipline. Does that make sense? In other words, archaeology is part of many disciplines, but it's not the main one. He's been all the way to Skagway in a t-shirt. I don't think they wipe many t-shirts in Skagway. It's too cold. Anyway. So, for example, what do I mean? Archaeology can be applied to history, historical studies. Archaeology can be applied to anthropological studies. Archaeology can be applied to classical studies, etc. But in none of those disciplines is archaeology seen as the epitome of that discipline. In history, for example, since that's my main discipline, I've had to argue for the use of archaeology in historical studies. I had to fight for it. For example, when I wrote my dissertation was about the archaeology of a site called Abila, A-B-I-L-A. And my advisor was fine with it, my approach, but you have to form a committee when you work on a PhD. And a committee is made up of usually 4 to 5 faculty members. Kind of depends. Anyway, I had one particular person on my committee who basically announced at one point that what I was doing was not history. They weren't quite sure what I was doing, but it was not history. Okay, so that could have shut the whole thing down, could have led to a lot of trouble. So what I told this professor is that, well, what I am doing is ancient social history. Ancient social history. Now, I knew another professor on my committee was very big into social history, and social history was kind of a hot topic at that time. And so I knew that professor would sort of come to my defense if I identified myself as a social historian. How's that? So that's what I did. Well, I mean, it kind of is. I mean, it wasn't lying, but it was just putting it in a way that made it harder for them to just try to shut me down. So I made it, right? I got the degree. I finished the dissertation. Everybody signed it. And like it or not, I actually have a PhD. I know a lot of people don't like that, but I do. Okay. Many just don't care. A lot of them don't even know. Most students don't know. Anyway, so what I'm saying is, in history, they don't think archaeology is really history. In classical studies, they don't think it's really classical studies. And in anthropology, they don't think it's really anthropological enough. Why? Well, in anthropology, the thing that sort of runs all the departments is cultural anthropology, not archaeology. Classics, it's all the people who deal with the texts, you know, the Greek text or the Latin text. It's not people that do the archaeology. They're sort of seen as the people that can't handle the textual stuff, so they do archaeology or something. The same in other departments, you know, like religion departments, Bible departments. The list could go on and on. Archaeology finds a home, or maybe I should say archaeologists have to find a home in a variety of disciplines. Because, I hate to break this to people, there's no money in archaeology. As I've often said, I would not require to be paid if no one required money of me. It's not that I'm interested in money. I'm only interested in money because it's necessary to live. So, to do that then, I must have an academic home. Also, when I was in graduate school, I had completed I guess by that time, 3 master's degrees, and I was going to work on a PhD, and so I applied to a large university in Boston. It was Boston University, so I guess that qualifies. Because they had a PhD program, I suppose they still do, in archaeology. So I thought I'm going to get my PhD in archaeology. And so I was accepted to the program, I was preparing to go, and then I was trying to see how am I going to pay for this. Pretty expensive to live in Boston. Pretty expensive to go to Boston University. And so I asked them, because one of the ways you can help pay for your graduate education at most universities is you get what's called a graduate assistantship or a teaching assistantship. They have different names, teaching fellowships and so forth. They have sort of jobs that they give graduate students where basically they either teach undergrads or they help with teaching undergrads, by grading or sometimes lecturing or doing different things. So I inquired, well, what kind of graduate assistantships do you have in the archaeology department? The response was none, because we don't have an undergraduate archaeology department. They only had a graduate archaeology department. And so that's when I decided I was not going to Boston University to get a PhD in archaeology, because I began to search and see that there are very, very few undergraduate archaeology programs in the United States. Even Boston University, recognized as pretty much a leader at that time, and I think still, in archaeological studies with a PhD in archaeology, does not have an undergraduate degree in archaeology. So that led me to believe that if I got a PhD in archaeology, I'd have a hard time finding a position teaching archaeology at a university. So I stuck with history. And then I did archaeology as my research. Hence the professor who thought I was not really doing history because I was doing archaeology. So I just tell you that to let you know that how do they run a program like that at Boston University without a department? They pull people from other departments primarily to be the graduate faculty. So you have somebody who's in the classical studies area, you have somebody maybe in this area, that area, and they each come and they offer courses and graduate courses in this. Anyway, perhaps too much information, but it lets you know then, for example, I know anthropologists who do archaeology, but they are not considered to be the stars of the program, because archaeology is not considered to be the sort of highest measure of anthropology, certainly not of classics, nor of history, nor of biblical studies. Archaeology has pretty much been dropped by most biblical studies people anymore. They don't even offer courses in it anymore. So what I'm saying is this course is basically a kind of biblical archaeology course, a New Testament archaeology course. I call it History and Archaeology of the Greco-Roman World, because that's what it is, but I focus on the biblical stuff because I have an interest in that. But I think what you will find is most places that have archaeology, that offer courses in it, that have a minor, maybe a major or a concentration. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to get an archaeology minor started here. I have to work on that today and present it tomorrow to the curriculum committee, so that hopefully in the fall we'll have it in the catalog. All of that comes normally because of one person, one highly motivated person who's going to actually go through all the trouble of trying to do archaeology, start programs, offer courses, and when that person is no longer at the institution for whatever reason, that stuff generally all leaves. In other words, they don't go out and try to hire someone to fill that role. They hired me to teach history. I am teaching history, but I'm also not so clandestinely trying to teach archaeology and to carry out archaeology, okay? But if I were to leave or whatever, they would not seek out someone to teach what I'm teaching necessarily. I mean, it might happen, but I'm just saying that would not be the priority, be just to teach history. If the guy wants to try to do this archaeology stuff, well that's okay. But okay, so you see what I'm saying? Archaeology is not the main focus of, as far as I can determine, any. Now, you will find occasional places where archaeology has been able to fight its way to actually some recognition, but that's pretty rare. Mostly it's one person usually. Maybe you can find a kindred spirit somewhere, but usually it's just one. Now, so that means that archaeology is, there are a few big research universities where you can get a degree in it. There are some undergrad institutions where you can get a degree in it. One is the University of Evansville, has a degree in undergraduate degree in archaeology. And I've spoken at their thing. I dug with some of the professors there and some of the students. And I think it's a fine program. But that's fairly rare. That's a rare opportunity, a rare place. Yes?
I was going to say, you actually listed some of those in case we wanted to see if those universities have anything that might help us with our site presentations.
Oh, your site presentations.
Yeah, I was just saying, like if those are good places for archaeological stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would look to, rather than a university, well, I would look for some of these, like I told you, the Anchor Bible Dictionary. If you have anything that's sort of mentioned in the Bible, I would go to a Bible dictionary first off. Anchor Bible Dictionary would be a good one. There is an encyclopedia of excavations in the Holy Land. There is the Oxford Encyclopedia of Near Eastern Archaeology. If you're going away from that area, like say if you're going to Italy, Spain, England, as some of you have chosen, you'll have to search the site itself, but you will be able to find standard reference works on it. I don't know if those, like the University of Chicago has a thing called ABZU, A-B-Z-U, which is online source. It has a lot of information, but it's mainly focused on the ancient Near East, Iraq, Egypt, that sort of thing. That's a good site. There is another site called Perseus. I forgot which universities does that. Maybe it's Cornell, somebody like that. They have a lot of classical sites, more Latin or let's say Roman and Greek sites on Perseus or Perseus Online, something like that. That would be a good one to check. I haven't checked it in a while, but it had a lot of stuff on it the last time I looked at it. I'd have to think about it. So, if you have questions, maybe email me. I could try to send you at least some links or something. But I would start there. Another thing that I would encourage you to do, if you don't use it, Have you ever used Google Scholar? Google Scholar. Google Scholar, you just type in Google Scholar in Google and it'll take you to the thing. It looks just like Google, except it only searches for academic resources. It'll work a lot better on campus than off, because it ought to be linked to our on-campus things that are available. But nonetheless, it will send you to journal articles, books. It's not going to give you full text, but it will give you a start in finding things. Okay, Google Scholar, pretty good place to start as well for a lot of general academic research. You know, don't neglect a credible encyclopedia. You know, I am not morally opposed to Wikipedia. However, you've got to be very careful with Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is not like a standard reference, in that the material in there has not really been looked over carefully by an expert in the field. In other words, you create an account, you can go in and start typing stuff into Wikipedia. And you can go in and change stuff and delete stuff and add stuff. I've found it. I remember a few years ago when I was living in Kentucky, a big news came that, because the whole Wikipedia thing operates in its own world. You know, they don't really reveal who are editors and who does this. That's a big difference. Like if you pick up Encyclopedia Britannica or even an online one, you can see who's the general editor, who's the editor over these other things. You often see who wrote the article, that kind of thing. It goes through a process. If I want to write something and have it appear in say an encyclopedia, I've written a lot of stuff for encyclopedias. Okay, I do research, I sit down, I write it, I send it. It doesn't mean it automatically appears as I sent it. Other people read it, they edit it, they change it. Sometimes they send it back to me for me to change things. And then finally it'll get published. Okay? So that means that by the time, like say, if you look at one of my articles or somebody else saying the Anchor Bible Dictionary, that article has gone through a vetting process, a review process by, there's probably been, well, I don't know how many people, but multiple people have looked at each article, have read it, looked it over, and said, okay, yeah, this makes sense. And then it got published. Wikipedia is not like that, okay? For example, one of the main editors, now this was a few years ago, but the reason it stuck out in my mind is because I was living in Kentucky. One of the main editors of Wikipedia, at least one section of it, was a guy who was a college dropout who lived in Maysville, Kentucky. And he had gone to Center College, which is a good college in Kentucky, a private school. He'd gone like 2 or 3 years. He had dropped out, and he was making money being an editor of Wikipedia. But he had portrayed himself as having a doctorate and so forth. In other words, he'd gotten pretty high up in this thing without really any degree, any college degree, and was sort of passing judgment on all these things. So I'm just saying, it's not a bad place to start. But I would be careful using it, So, I mean, I use it sometimes, but you just have to be careful and have to know the source. It's just kind of like if somebody I meet around the university tells me something. I don't always mean that I accept all of it as what I would call good old gospel truth. Okay, sometimes there might be some reviews possible. So anyway, archaeology has many categories. It can be in many disciplines, but it is not the preferred discipline, at least as far as I can determine, in any of those. Now, I suppose maybe some anthropologists might want to arm wrestle me over this, but I don't think so. Most of the people that really control anthropology departments and anthropology journals and textbooks and so forth are cultural anthropologists. Anyway, so let's take a look at it. There's different ways you can divide up archaeology. We might use these two terms, historic archaeology, prehistoric. So you might say, well, I know what prehistoric is, right? It means really, really old stuff. Not necessarily. When I just told you that we had an arrowhead found on our dig out there a few weeks back that dates to about, let's say, at least 1000 AD, perhaps earlier, that is prehistoric. It's prehistoric for North America. It's not prehistoric for Europe or prehistoric for the Near East, but it is for here. Why? Because prehistoric is not a set time. It just means you don't have written records. We don't have written records from 500 AD in North America. We just don't. Therefore, it's prehistoric. So, I mean, sometimes we use the word prehistoric and some people think like dinosaurs and stuff. No. It just means we don't have written records. Nobody was writing anything down in North America in, say, 600 AD. So therefore, there's no history. History is tied to writing. That's why the one professor gave me a hard time about my dissertation topic, because a lot of it didn't have to do with written records. It had to do with physical evidence, pottery. I had a few inscriptions. I had a few things. But he said, I don't know what this is, but it's not really history. But, you know, social history deals a lot with things that are not written down, because social history is trying to deal with the people who often couldn't write, or they didn't write. They didn't have time to write anything down. We don't have any of their written records. But yet they still have a history. Okay, so that's part of the debate. Is history only written records? That's the way most people determine it. That's not the way I determine it. But then again, that's just me. Okay? So prehistoric means studies prior to written records. So what I'm doing here in Florida is prehistoric. Well, so far, we did find part of a shotgun shell. When was it? Saturday. Everything blends together for me. A couple days ago, we found the brass, the thing that holds the primer and stuff. We found just that part, because I believe the rest of it was made out of paper, which is the way they used to do shotgun shells. It was paper, sort of waxed paper, with a brass plate. Today they make it all with plastic, of course, so you find the shells themselves, but the paper cartridges aren't going to last. So my guess is, and I haven't done more research, that shotgun shell is probably about 60, 70 years old or older, okay, but not in the last, say, 50 years or so. Since World War II, increasingly used plastics. All right. The time frame, as I've said, varies about prehistoric based on your location. Here in Florida, yeah, we don't really start getting written records until a guy named Columbus shows up, right? Till the Europeans show up. So roughly AD 1500. So here in the New World, if something is pre-Columbian, right? Pre-Columbian history, pre-Columbian cultures, for the most part in North America have no writing. In, say, Mexico and Central America, there's very limited writing. So we don't really have archives of a lot of things. We do have some. But mostly, definitely North America, 1500 we start to get European records. And then that begins to grow from there. Yes?
For different groups of people that still today are like hunter-gatherer society.
Still today, yeah.
Would you consider them living in prehistoric, or would that be?
Well, I would say their culture is prehistoric, I suppose you might say, but most of the cultures today that don't have writing, like let's say they live on an island in the South Pacific, or kind of like that guy that went to that island off of India, right? Right? Those people don't have writing. So I would say that we do have some written records about those people, perhaps, or about that island, or so they are appearing in a historical record today. But we're not getting anything of, well, I shouldn't say we're not getting any of their perspective. It all depends. You know, like you might want to go to that island and try to talk to those people and say, hey, I'd like to do a little video interview with you and put it on my blog, my vlog, my video blog, or whatever. Put you on the YouTube, as I call it. Well, that may not go too well, but I guess what I'm saying is we do have some historical records of the people, even if we don't have any historical records from the people. So in other words, once the Europeans show up, they begin to write about the people that they find, say, here, and that's how we learn about them. So we'd say that's history about them, but we're not really getting much about the perspective of those people because they don't write. Okay, so I guess that's a good question. I suppose it'd be very difficult today for anything to be prehistoric because we have so much documentation of things today. But I think you could be in a culture that you might call prehistoric, or, you know, illiterate, or however order. Probably don't like, that's probably not politically, probably can't use the word illiterate anymore. That's probably not politically correct. How about reading and writing challenged? Well, the first known writing anywhere in the great big world is 3000 BC, roughly 3000 BC. So anything before 3000 BC anywhere is prehistoric. Okay? When does it end? Well, in, say, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and so forth, the Near East, pretty much you can put down 3000 BC. After that, we're now into historic periods in the Middle East. Still in Europe, though. There's no writing in Europe yet. So anyway, you get the idea. So it's a term I think has some use. But, you know, if you want to try to make a hard and fast determinations about it, you can spend a lot of time on it. But the main idea is we don't have written sources about what those people are doing or what they thought, that kind of thing, from those people. And in fact, in many cases, we don't have any record at all, even from anyone who observed them. As, say, we would, and say, after 1500, if the Spanish show up, they say, yeah, we encountered these people, this is what they look like, this is what they eat, this is, you know, that sort of thing. Then we start to get a record of them. So, like I said, here in the New World, circa AD 1500, of course, circa is a Latin phrase, it means around, like where we get our word circle. Or circus, which is what most of my days are, like a circus. Circle, circa, around or about AD 1500. So somebody will say, oh, well, Columbus came in 1492. AD 1500 is not correct. Well, okay. But I'm going to still say it. Circa AD 1500. A nice round date for us to remember. Okay, so those are some categories. Prehistoric, and like I said, that can vary. Now the other thing we can do is begin to look at archaeological categories by sort of region. I always tell people that in archaeology, most archaeologists choose a chronological focus as well as a geographic focus. Does that make sense? A chronological and a geographical focus. I'm a bit of an odd duck. And I suppose the only thing strange about that sentence is a bit. But I tend to be interested in a wide range of things, including archaeology, so I don't limit myself as some. Like some people I know, they are basically limited to Iron Age period of Palestine or something, or Jordan, and maybe Israel and Jordan. The Iron Age, that's what they study. I study the Iron Age. Sometimes people ask me, what is it you, I say archaeology. Well, what archaeology? And I say, where? And they say, well, what in that? They want it to be very narrow. Okay, I've studied Iron Age archaeology, but that's not my only interest. Okay? I've worked a lot in Greco-Roman, for example. I've worked in Byzantine period. I've worked in other periods as well. So that's why, for example, I heard from a certain someone that a certain professor at a certain other university wanted to know who this person was, that was me, and what was it, why was I excavating in Florida? What do I know about it? Why am I doing it? Basically, the implication being I have no business digging in Florida because that was their purview, not mine. Well, admittedly, I'm learning, but I thought that's what life was about, right? We learn new things. The techniques of the archaeology are the same from place to place, pretty much. I mean, there are some peculiarities some people develop, but pretty much the way you dig and how you look for things and so forth, the way you handle the artifacts and so forth, that's all pretty much the same. But it is the material culture, that is what you find, that you're not as familiar with. I can obviously recognize bone, pottery, and shells, metal, and so forth, and sort it out that way. I can then, but to be honest, I am studying to learn the pottery of the woodland period. That is not my specialty. But it doesn't mean I can't excavate it. It doesn't mean I can't identify it. It doesn't mean I can't then ask other people for help. That's the way you learn. Nobody's an expert at everything. Matter of fact, a lot of people aren't an expert at anything. So admittedly, I am a jack of all trades, master of none, but I've been digging mostly in the Middle East. So that would be, by some measures, we could call it Syro-Palestinian archaeology. Syro meaning Syria, Palestinian means Palestine. This is what one person in particular lobbied for several years ago, a guy by the name of Dr. William Deaver, to call archaeology not biblical archaeology, tying it to the Bible, but Syro-Palestinian, tying it to the geography. Now, the result of that, which he now laments, I believe, is that it has caused the death of biblical archaeology, which means that most seminaries and other people studying the Bible completely ignore archaeology. Certainly was not his intent, I suppose, but that's basically what's happened. All those jobs dried up. They don't hire people, well, I'll say they won't hire any, but it's very rare that somebody's going to hire somebody to teach archaeology, say at a seminary or in some, like here. There is one course on the books before I got here. It was called Biblical Archaeology. It was a graduate course. When I found out it's not offered very often, I don't know when the last time it was offered. Mainly because one professor wanted it in there. Well, then there's classical archaeology. Classical archaeology deals with the subject of the classics or classical studies. Classical studies have to deal with Latin, Greek literature primarily, say like the writings of Homer or Cicero, or do you call him Cicero, and that sort of thing. And somebody who's involved in that or in that discipline or department who then wants to go excavate and look in those periods, we would call that classical archaeology, or a classical archaeologist. They would dig mostly in Italy and Greece, but also in Spain and France and some other places. Occasionally, a few of them will wander into the Near East, but not usually, okay? It doesn't mean we don't have any Greco-Roman stuff in the Near East. We just don't have any classical archaeologists in the Near East, or very few. A few will wander in. Then, of course, historical archaeology. It focuses on the period when written records can supplement the excavation. When I lived in North Carolina, I lived very close to Virginia, I looked into a program they had at Williamsburg, College of Williamsburg, or College of William and Mary, and they had one in historic archaeology that focused on, you know, basically colonial period. And I visited the excavations at Jamestown and some of those places like that. Here you take the written records that they have, you're still doing the field archaeology, and you try to weave it together. And that's really what we're talking about here. So we try to supplement what we're doing, we try to inform it by whatever written sources we have. In Syro-Palestinian archaeology, obviously the Bible should play a big role. In this class, we're looking at Greco-Roman period. Well, we should really be looking at the book of Acts pretty heavily, and the Gospels, that tell us geography, that describe cities or streets or scenes that are going on, to see if we can identify what it is and what is happening, you know, what happens there and what's possible. For example, Jesus tells many parables where he describes agricultural life, paths, walking, planting, sowing, thrashing, so forth, right? Harvesting. He also describes lamps and lighting of lamps and the use of lamps. We also see descriptions of pottery and the drink, you know, wine, like Jesus changed water into wine, and he talks about the different vessels that they use. Some of them are stone vessels, some of them are ceramic vessels, and so forth. So there are things that are described in the Bible, and I submit, if you want to understand it better, the text, whether it's the Bible or any of these other things, you need to understand the material culture better, then you can understand the text better as well. All right, we'll end it there for right now.